Oh, thank you. The findings presented here at this symposium have not previously been presented. We are privileged to be the first audience with which recent discoveries will be shared. The format of today's proceedings will be a combination of panel discussions, plus individual presentations and the opportunity for questions and answers from the audience. Throughout the day, we'll be hearing discussions about the popular imagery of cowboys and how this imagery was not necessarily an accurate representation of their lives and experiences. We'll learn about the creation of the cowgirl and how women who worked on ranches and took part in rodeos and Wild West shows often used their clothing to express their identity as women. We'll learn that gender and identity were much more fluid in pre-Columbian indigenous societies, and communities often held in high esteem individuals who were two-spirited. And we'll also take a deeper dive into early 20th century gender and politics when we look at Oklahoma's own Alice Robertson, the second woman in the country to be elected to the U.S. Congress and Oklahoma's first and only U.S. Congresswoman. She distanced herself from women's movements, even though she herself benefited from the gains made by such movements. And finally, we'll learn about how art historians' own biases and worldviews often influence how they interpret historical evidence and artwork. At this time, I would like to introduce our first panel. Laura Arata is Assistant Professor of History at Oklahoma State University, specializing in public history, the American West, and popular culture. Her recent article, Terror and Tourism, Lynching, Legend, and the Montana Vigilantes, appeared in the Pacific Northwest Quarterly. Her forthcoming book is titled Race and the Wild West, Sarah Bickford and the Legend of Virginia City, Montana, 1870 to 1930. Johanna Bloom is Associate Curator of Western Art, History, and Culture at the Eiteljorg Museum. Her curatorial experience includes the exhibitions The Real West, Gold, Riches, and Ruin, and Blake Little, Photographs from the Gay Rodeo, among many others. Bloom's research focuses on environmental and social history and the American West, and the rich diversity of that region. In 2014, she accepted the, is it Paladin? Paladin Award, presented by the Gay and Lesbian Rodeo Heritage Foundation on behalf of the Eiteljorg Museum. And then, last but not least, Dr. Tracy Hanshew is a clinical assistant professor at Washington State University, Tri-Cities. Dr. Hanshew is active in public history and community outreach, having been a guest speaker for the University of Calgary and Calgary, Alberta, at regional museums across Oklahoma, and a consultant for a digital podcast about rodeo cowgirls in Oklahoma. She has 2 forthcoming books about rodeo cowgirls. Please help me welcome Laura Arata.
Hi. Oh, enthusiastic response. Thank you so much for being here. I just want to say a quick thank you to everyone at the Gilcrease who made my research here this summer just a really fabulous experience, and nothing like this comes together without the hard work and dedication and a lot of hours of a lot of people. So thank you to the Gilcrease, and I think they all deserve a round of applause. So, talk a little bit about cowboy imagery creation. And before we get started, this might sound a little critical of cowboy imagery formation, but I did want to. Okay, can you hear me now? And this is coming from a very deep place of beginning research for my next book, which is going to be about my own family history, in which it turned out after my grandfather and father died, I'd always thought of them as cowboys. That was my legacy growing up in California on a working ranch. And it turned out my grandfather was born as an Italian day laborer turned bootlegger, did a lot of other things before he became a cowboy. So I'm interested in that process of identity formation, and hopefully there's some good questions about that by the end. So. I'm not what people think a cowboy should be, Charlie Russell admitted. Having been, in his own words, neither a good roper nor rider, Russell's relatively short career as a cowboy was largely spent sketching by day, keeping night watch over the other cowboys' horses, and at best assisting sporadically with actually herding cattle. Some considered him a good cowboy first, others a picture historian of the ranges who spent time masquerading as a cowpuncher. Russell, for his part, acknowledged that the papers have been kind to me, many times more kind than true. Yet he embraced such a position of authority that by the early 20th century, Russell's works were accepted as conclusive depictions, literal representations of the differences between the real cowboys of the Old West and those of later literary and cinematic origin. To differentiate between the authentic and the fabricated, audiences looked to those who had been there to show them what the Old West was like. William F. Cody, whose spectacular shows brought representations of the Wild West to audiences around the world, became the premier embodiment of this authority. But artists like Russell also played an important role in establishing what cowboys were supposed to be. In fact, he stands alone in that kind of work, Russell's friend, Montana cowboy poet and actor Wallace Coburn proclaimed in 1905. And posterity will know the true cowboy only through Russell's pictures of this picturesque and dashing ruler of America's Great Plains. And while there's truth to the fact that Russell painted what he saw, this tendency to view his art as a complete record of the cowboy is problematic. That his subject matter was refined to reflect audience expectations of what cowboys were supposed to have been, as much as it represented any reality of the ranges, becomes clear when we consider matters of race and the depiction of certain kinds of violence. By the turn of the 20th century, imagery associated with the cowboy had been shaped by 2 decades worth of stage plays, dime novels, newspaper serials, Wild West shows, even Nickelodeons. In 1903, Coburn published a book of poetry, illustrated by Russell, titled Rhymes from a Roundup Camp. And its aim, as Coburn claimed, was to tell the life of the cowboy as it actually was, taken from real life as he and Russell had experienced it. And one short poem, simply titled The Cowboy, very neatly summarized this vision. Over the prairie the cowboy rides, as a modern knight he stands alone, always ready with heart in hand, a typical prince of the western zone. No other land can claim his like, he's a Native American, born and bred, a product of God's noblest land, the land for which his fathers bled. It's like so cheesy, even like reading it seriously is a little bit difficult, right? But this poem, which was completed by the Russell sketch that you see here of a cowboy with his wide-brimmed hat flying, captured in very simple form how the cowboy rode in popular imagination. Native to America, with a lowercase n, by nature of his ancestors having fought on the correct side of the Revolution, and transformed by participation in the process of the westward advancing frontier, with the unquestionable chivalry and the morals to bravely defend anyone or anything that happened to be in need of his assistance. But this vision of cowboys as a quintessentially American creation rooted in European traditions of knighthood neatly glossed over the reality that their origins and their numbers were far more multicultural, tracing back to vaqueros of Spanish, Mexican, Afro-Spanish, Mestizo, and Native American descent who rode after cattle on rangelands in Mexico, Texas, and Alta California for 2 centuries prior to American independence. After the Mexican-American War, African-American slaves provided much of the manpower needed to maintain cattle herds as plantations and cotton spread west. The era of the cattle drives lasted only from about 1866, when the end of the Civil War and the arrival of the Kansas Pacific Railroad made them possible, and 1886, when the completion of the Texas and Pacific Railroad made them unnecessary. But even at the end of these 2 decades, the idea of the cowboy had not taken hold in popular memory, in part because of who cowboys were, and also because cattle raising very quickly became an industry. And like the steel, mining, packing, and other industries, it also needed a labor force for what was undeniably hard, dirty, and often monotonous work, as Russell captured here. Also, cowboys in the public imagination in the mid-19th century were not exactly worthy of emulation. The prevailing notion of cowboys, even as late as the 1870s, is that they were untrustworthy, unruly, and prone to violence. The popular press had seized on cowboys as a stock source of lurid copy. During this decade, virtually every issue of the most popular news weeklies featured at least one illustration of cowboys in lawless and violent behavior. And while this might be somewhat exaggerated, representative articles bore titles such as, quote, "The Cowboy of the Plains," a sketch of a very boisterous and often murderous character. Such articles described cowboys as a terror and with a dangerously excessive exuberance of spirit. The relative frequency with which the word appeared in a cross-section of digitized newspapers, I'm sorry, there's my picture of some lawless cowboys according to Russell, and we're gonna come back to them, but standard tropes, right, of cowboys shooting up the town, this actually shouldn't surprise us all that much. The word cowboy appeared only 73 times in newspapers between 1865 and 1870, and I'm using here a cross-section from the Library of Congress Chronicling America project, which is a good representative sample of American newspapers at the time. And these references overwhelmingly occurred in context of Delancey's Cowboys, a loyalist paramilitary unit that did battle on the border between British and American forces during the Revolutionary War, with one of their key functions being the seizure of cattle to feed the loyalist population of besieged New York City. Hence, they were known as cowboys. Even in 1880, near the end of the era of the cattle drives, the word appeared in print only 284 times, and many of these referenced either Tory cowboys from the Revolution or rebel cowboys from the American South during the Civil War, and sometimes explicitly with connections drawn to the Ku Klux Klan. And here's one example of many. Between 1876 and 1880, however, usage of the word surged to over 18,000 and continued to increase thereafter, hitting highs of 20, 25, or 30,000 in every year after. That initially the public cared less who exactly these cowboys were than what they represented becomes even more clear if we consider matters of race. By some estimates, and numbers vary wildly from less than 5,000 to more than 12,000 because we don't actually know for sure exactly how many cowboys were on the range at this time, up to 1/4 of all cowboys who rode American ranges were black. Another 15% were Mexican, and an unknown number were Native American or mixed race. So how was it then that if as many as 1 in every 3 cowboys was non-white, and cowboys in general were considered routinely dangerous and violent, that audiences around the world came to associate the idea of cowboys with mostly white, knight-like heroes? And how did the general public make the leap from viewing cowboys' daily activities as altogether secondary to fighting off hostile Indians, pursuing rustlers and holding necktie parties for them, saving the rancher's daughter from Mexican raiders, and engaging in quick-draw gunfights in dusty streets? To become revered, the image of cowboys had to undergo radical change, and this occurred after 1885 thanks to the popularity of Buffalo Bill's Wild West, the development of the first novels featuring true cowboy heroes, and changing audience demand. The creation of cowboy imagery sprang from a complex nexus of popular entertainments which were at their core nationalistic and supportive of a singular narrative of Euro-American conquest of the continent. The idea that it was manifest destiny for white Americans to control what became the United States superseded what had been a continent of empires before 1850. The idea is that pioneers moved west into the wilds of this unknown frontier, as we see in this famous image by John Gast, pushing native people out before them and drawing civilization in their wake and conquering whatever stood in between that ultimate goal. It was unfortunate but inevitable that it caused the disappearance of Indians in their natural state and of animals like the buffalo, which of course become a revered then trope in Western history. In fact, Charlie Russell's little signature, right, is a skull. And the transformative power of uncivilized nature. It's not coincidence that William F. Cody's vision of the Wild West proved definitive at precisely the same juncture the frontier was declared closed in 1890. Cody managed to seamlessly meld his real-life experiences on the plains as a teamster, a buffalo hunter, and Army scout with stage acting experience and a growing public nostalgia for an imagined past. Part reenactment, part rodeo, part circus, Buffalo Bill's Wild West always rested on Cody's claims of including authentic representatives of the West, be they human or animal performers, including horses, longhorns, and buffalo. Early on, the majority of Cody's troupe were cowboys, many of them employed on his ranch. Observing them, Cody, who had no prior knowledge of cattle ranching before this, quickly determined that cowboy life was, quote, nothing but hard work, but he greatly respected their horsemanship skills. Familiar with organizing rodeos, Cody dedicated significant portions of the Wild West show to the exhibition of horsemanship, roping skills, and trick shooting. And these cowboy actors also naturally doubled as the rescue parties led by Cody to save the settlers, the wagon train, and the stagecoach. In a somewhat surprising twist, even to Cody, audiences took to cowboys, so Cody quickly cleaned up their image and expanded their role in the show. By 1886, presenting some facts about cowboys, a previously critical Harper's Weekly was insisting that their boisterous image was undeserved. They're always ready for a bit of innocent fun, it explained to readers, but are not perpetually spoiling for a fight, as has so often been said of them. In the popular mind, cowboys came to be associated with Indian fighting and pioneering and daring rescues and all the tropes that we associate with them now. Even though Wild West shows often included cowboys of different races displaying their various skills, the full name of the show, after all, is Buffalo Bill's Wild West and Congress of Rough Riders of the World, the presentation of white cowboys as heroes in the arena fostered the development of a myth that, with the exception of an occasional lowbrow villain or comic accented vaquero, all cowboys existed only as the noblest and purest Anglo-Saxon type, as in Owen Wister's The Virginian. Black cowboys could win contests of horsemanship, in other words, but white cowboys rescued imperiled white women and children. Cowboys owed their newfound popularity, ironically, to a decidedly modern era. In an age of seemingly unmitigated technological progress, industrialization, and increasing immigration, the West became the central representation for a nostalgic lost world. The last, most recent frontier of the cattle kingdom and the cowboy became synonymous with longing for a pre-industrial, pre-corporate, pre-modern past where men could truly be self-made and self-reliant. In a busy and increasingly mechanized and managed world, cowboys became something of an antidote, the last free individual in a society that was rapidly destroying individualism. This convergence of nostalgia, reenactment, and popular demand had lasting implications. The idea that cowboys fought Indians for dominance of the plains, for example, became so ubiquitous as to be unquestioned and then projected backward. As a boy in 1860s Missouri, one biographer later insisted, Charles Russell was more interested in playing Indians and cowboys in the woods behind his home than attending school. So at 15, he went west to become a cowboy. But while frontier encounters between Americans and native counterparts had been part of American lore for centuries, and young Russell did in fact go west, he could not have envisioned playing cowboys and Indians per se, because that trope did not exist yet. The cowboys Russell knew often spoke of the dangers posed by Indians, but they did not often meet them in direct conflict. Lamenting that his point of entry into the West came late, Russell, like his contemporary and friend John Barrows, proclaimed to feel the sting of being late, of being the non-combatants left in the rear by the real pioneers, his emphasis. All the more telling then that Russell chose to portray generalized violence he'd not actually witnessed, like stagecoach holdups, rather than that which he actually did. And we're going to talk about just one example. In 1884, while Russell was employed as a night hawk for a Montana cattle operation, a posse of real-life cowboys hunted down, captured, and lynched dozens of suspected cattle rustlers, most without any proof of guilt, and all with no trials. Though the acknowledged death toll of the stranglers, as they became known, stands at 14, the number was probably much higher and remains unknown. We do know that they burned the bodies of at least half a dozen of their victims, and that most of the men who participated refused to speak of these events even decades later. Russell certainly knew of these events firsthand, and he could have painted them under the guise of a necessary response by cattlemen to rustlers. This would have fit with many tropes. Yet while Russell made room for outlaws in some of his works, the stranglers did not fit with what the cowboy was supposed to embody by the time he became well known as an artist. Rugged, polite, gentle, dedicated to justice. As one chronicler later explained, cowboys are always good guys. There are no bad cowboys. There are bad men, bad guys, bandits, desperados, robbers, gunslingers, but never a bad cowboy as such. The Charles Russell deliberately chose to recast these subjects through an opaque lens of frontier violence speaks volumes to the transformation of cowboy imagery. There's ample evidence that the stranglers went after their victims not because of any direct danger, but because cattle rustling threatened the bottom line of the wealthy, largely Eastern capitalists who employed them. And Russell's paintings of outlaws are typically nondescript, as with Hands Up, seen here. And on a side note on this appeared in a book that was co-authored by Granville Stewart, with whom Russell was good friends. And Stewart was actually the leader of the Stranglers. Sometimes they're referred to as Stewart's Stranglers. So we cannot give Russell the benefit of a doubt that he didn't know here. He certainly knew firsthand of these events. In other cases, as with Innocent Allies, the getaway horses are featured as the primary subject matter. There's little about these interpretations to suggest their specificity to any particular events or locations. One of the very few attempts to actually depict the 1884 vigilantes came from Russell's friend and protege, Olaf Karl Seltzer. The text that accompanied this image, Cattle Rustlers Stand, in a volume titled Montana in Miniature, gave no details beyond discussing what it meant to be a rustler and alter brands. But the purpose of this volume, according to one contemporary newspaper review, was, quote, to leave to posterity a paramount record of Western history, which will have been recorded by men who knew the West, whose home was the West, who lived in the West when the West was the West, and who possessed the ability to correctly record the West on canvas. I did not make up all those Wests. That is in the original print. So this made it problematic that Seltzer, who immigrated to the United States in 1892, was heavily reliant on Russell, who in this case left him very little to work with. The type of violence that involved committing murder, not to preserve life, but profits, existed uncomfortably alongside growing and increasingly international lure of the West. After spending his youth fascinated with the West of North America and everything pertaining to it, Emil Lenders found that he had, quote, an overwhelming desire to paint this glamorous page of US history, but unfortunately knew very little about it from actual experience on account of the inconvenient fact that he grew up in England. This would not do. I fully realized that I had to familiarize myself with the subject and at first hand before I could execute truthfully and vividly on canvas, Lenders noted. And thus, in his words, he traded the luxuries of life for the strenuous life of a cowboy and served the apprenticeship from the bottom up. Future President Theodore Roosevelt had not actually yet coined the term the strenuous life, so Lenders couldn't have traded in for it quite so soon. And brushing aside the fact that by definition he arrived in North America too late to have witnessed much of the frontier firsthand, Lenders proudly proclaimed it my task and privilege to perpetuate on canvas a page of the US history of a glorious and glamorous past that will return no more. And execute that vision he did. But Lenders conveniently left out the part where shortly after arriving in the United States, he saw a performance of Buffalo Bill's Wild West at Madison Square Garden in New York and hired on with the show so he could study the picturesque Indians, broncos, cowboys, and wild steers as Buffalo Bill led the Wild West around the world. Later, with the encouragement of Cody and an invitation from the Miller brothers, he set up a ranch in Oklahoma and continued to paint scenes drawn from the 101 ranch shows, like the buffalo image we saw earlier. Ultimately, what Lenders viewed as the real West had been carefully curated by men like William F. Cody and the Miller brothers, who he befriended, and by other artists like Russell and Frederick Remington, who he considered authorities. Unlike Russell, Remington did, early on in his career, include a few individuals of color in his works, and we'll look at those in just a second. But still, on the whole, he did not record facts in his paintings as such. He presented a carefully constructed image colored by his own convictions. And this belied the reality that many of the men who invented the idea of the Wild West were elite Easterners, and each was a deliberate and self-conscious myth maker. The development of nostalgia around the American cowboy and the rapidity with which it happened surprised even those with a vested interest in its perpetuation. The imagery of the knight of the range astride a trusted horse, gun holstered at the ready, clad in his boots and neckerchief and a broad-brimmed hat, took hold because cowboys came in the public mind to represent something beyond themselves. A West that brimmed with hope and was not yet sodden with the ambitions of robber barons and foreign capital. It was understood that the cowboy was essentially a laborer within this system, but he had his independence. He had the freedom to do what millions of Americans by the 20th century could not, simply cinch up his saddle and ride away in search of another sunset when a situation proved too sticky or too undesirable. And his responsibilities were those that he chose to care about, be they two or four-legged, and he self-sufficiently carried most of what he needed on his back. He was beholden to an employer, but not a time clock. The cowboy of imagination was not created on the range, but after it. And nostalgia can be, according to some critics, a paradoxical emotion, centered in longing for a past that of necessity is inauthentic because it does not take part in lived experience. Even at the beginning of Buffalo Bill's Wild West, Cody saw nothing spectacular about cowboys, in his own words. And at the beginning, his audiences knew very little about cowboys and, quote, cared less about them. Thanks to the holdover influence of the Revolutionary and Civil War characterizations, cowboy was still synonymous with armed desperados and terrorism when Buffalo Bill's Wild West gave its first performances. And events like the 1884 lynching spree, which did make national news and international news, did very little to dispel such notions. Carefully curated emissions influenced and reinforced what movie makers then later committed to film. While the distance between the authenticity supposedly claimed by artists like Russell and the creations of Hollywood directors seems great at first glance, the two mediums informed each other long before John Ford admitted that he considered Russell's paintings virtual storyboards. Early Hollywood westerns mimicked portrayals of cowboys from Wild West shows and made possible the careers of actors who embodied cowboys in this next incarnation. Among silent film cowboys, William S. Hart first gained fame for his supposedly accurate portrayals, and he paved the way for perhaps the most famous movie cowboy of the silent film era, Tom Mix, who surpassed him in popularity by projecting authenticity, even though everything about his personal image and the cowboy characters he portrayed was very carefully invented. Mix was, to be fair, a masterful horseman. He was a legitimate rodeo competitor, and he did most of his own stunts, which was impressive even at this time. But just as importantly, his experience with circus performing made him keenly aware of the importance of costuming. His flashy clothes translated well on screen, and they'd be standard for many later generations of movie cowboys. But they wouldn't have been realistic on the range, and in fact, most cowboys wore the same set of clothes from beginning to trail drive to the end, and then they bought a new set in town, and that was the process. Mix was fond of claiming that he was born in Texas, and at age 12 set up a one-gun shooting gallery with a gift .22 rifle to raise money to buy his own saddle, even though he had no horse of his own on which to use it. When he did finally acquire both a horse and a saddle, he rambled throughout the West looking for work as a cowboy before turning to film. The reality is, and I'm sorry to break it, Mix was born in Pennsylvania, and he could thank his father, who was a wealthy lumber merchant, for fostering an early love and a great skill with horses. Ironically, one factor in Mix's rising star is that audiences came to find William S. Hart's cowboys a little too realistic, i.e., they found them boring, including the costume, which you see here. As film transitioned into the sound era, a generation of audiences familiar with cowboy imagery looked for Western heroes who were morally upright and dressed in clean clothes, riding well-trained horses. And most audiences accepted a certain amount of Hollywood fabrication, but they failed to realize that other depictions of the West were just as much an invention as the railroad or barbed wire or the telephone or the airplane or talking pictures or other parts of the modern era. Both left little place for cowboys of color. While both feature and B westerns featured a scattering of black characters in the 1920s and 30s, they pretty much all represented stereotypic types in bit parts with few or no lines, and most of them served as comedic relief. Even supposedly realistic films such as Cimarron, which was made in 1930 and then remade several times, which depicted the Oklahoma land run, left no place for African Americans to participate in that process, which is a clear whitewashing of the more than 10,000 African Americans who staked claims, and willful ignorance of the fact that observers widely described their opposition at the time as unsavory cowboys. The Hollywood Western effectively became a segregated space, reflective of the demands of audiences. In these films, the saloon is the Western symbol of the public sphere, and the demographics of the people gathered there suggest the film's ideological vision of American society. Black cowboys might, in real life, have been allowed to stand at one end of the bar in towns they entered. In fact, this was fairly common. But they were almost never seen in Hollywood Western saloons, unless it was as entertainment. The racial divide was also felt among sidekicks. White ones could go anywhere the hero went. Black ones could not. And just as a side note, John Wayne in one of his first films had a black sidekick. They went looking for haunted gold together. It's also John Wayne's only horror movie. And they had to sleep in separate buildings in order to get this film produced. It was a remake, but they did some interesting things. And the sidekick, who was played by Blue Washington, who became a famous actor in his own right, is referred to at various points in the film as having a watermelon accent, a Sambo, a darky, very racist tropes. Effectively, Western films came to provide a surrogate for Dixie. Hollywood reinforced the idea that African Americans were out of place in the West. And as a result, like their real-life counterparts, Hollywood cowboys faced discrimination and exclusion from Western stories when they had black skin. With the exception of a few silent race films, mostly made in Chicago for black audiences, and 4 feature films starring Herb Jeffries, or Jeffrey, he did change his name, so you'll see it spelled both ways here, who became the era's only black singing cowboy in the late 1930s. According to his own account, Jeffries first conceived the idea of all black westerns while watching African Americans queue outside segregated theaters to watch Sunday matinee horse operas with all white casts in the Jim Crow South. He was a touring musician and a singer. A taken aback Jeffries ostensibly then encountered a little black boy crying amongst his playmates. He said they wouldn't let him play cowboy, Jeffries recalled, but in the real West, 1 of every 4 cowboys was black. So Jeffries determined that America's movie audiences needed a history lesson, and he eventually succeeded in having created and starring in 4 singing cowboy films, including Harlem Rides the Range and The Bronze Buckaroo, both of which came out in 1939. The Bronze Buckaroo was the last one, and they're all available on YouTube. They're in the public domain now. One of them has been lost, but the others are available in their entirety. Placing an all African-American cast at the center of a Western storyline allowed freedom not possible in films featuring white characters. In the real West, of course, while African-American cowboys might enjoy the rude quasi-equality of the roundup, the roping pen, the stampede, and the river crossing, and the respect of fellow cowboys, once they reached town, their inclusion or exclusion rested largely on the absence or presence of white women. Black cowboys could actually enter most gambling halls and some saloons and a few dry goods stores in most end-of-cattle drive trail towns. But they were almost always excluded from hotels and restaurants where women might be present, and the symbolic value of sitting down and eating together outweighed that of literally standing at a bar. In the estimation of one historian, the most rigorously segregated cowtown establishments were brothels staffed by white prostitutes. But still, and ironically, for a region that's best remembered for its danger and violence, their lives were probably safer than they would have been in the southern cotton regions, where lynching was becoming horrifically frequent at this time. Emerging from the era of Reconstruction and its devastating aftermath, the image of the cowboy came to represent the opportunity of the American dream. A couple images. African-American cowboys with, my suspicion is that this is Will Rogers. But there wasn't more information with this image. We'll have some more research to do, Renee and I. The freedom to reinvent oneself and find success in hard work, exactly as Charles Russell and many others like him had done successfully, is wrapped up in this representation. And this is also precisely the opportunity sought by many cowboys of color, who worked herding, rounding up, roping, branding, and caring for cattle, and found that preferable to the work of sharecropping. But the frontiers that represented freedom and opportunity for some did not provide the same for all in equal measure. Most black cowboys discovered that their ability to advance was limited by the color of their skin rather than the actual skills. And in some famous cases, like Nat Love, who becomes famous as Deadwood Dick, he actually ended his career as a cowboy and went on to become a Pullman porter. So there is movement away from this job, as we get a little bit later. Hollywood completed the final act of whitewashing American cowboys in the 20th century. The Hollywood production code prevented it, white audiences would not have accepted it, and increasingly actual African Americans died over the mere suggestion of impropriety toward white women. In other words, while real cowboys did not ride off in search of the rancher's daughter and to rescue her with any degree of frequency, it would not have been acceptable for non-white cowboys to effect such rescues, even in make-believe, on screen. Just as cowboy came to represent white men in American lexicon, lynching came to connote the murder of black men. And both cowboys and lynching victims could be of any race, of course, but the immediate association of one with white privilege and the other with starkly racial terror had lasting implications. Cowboys came to rest securely on their white privilege and their freedom and their independence and their ability to both effect rescues and commit crimes in the name of justice, like stopping bandits or cattle rustlers, were anchored in it. Though white cowboys quickly became the norm, cowboys of color were not entirely absent from the canvases of Western artists, and occasionally they appear clearly. As for instance, in Frederick Remington's The Coming and Going of the Pony Express, which has an African-American figure in the background very clearly. Emil Lenders became well acquainted with famed African-American cowboy and rodeo star Bill Pickett, who spent many years associated with the Miller brothers and was best known for inventing the sport of bulldogging. And Lenders painted Pickett at least once, astride a bronc in a 101 ranch corral, but this image doesn't clearly depict him as African-American aside from the title. In another debated case, and there's others who can speak to this more authoritatively than me, Remington's very famous image of the stampede may or may not feature an African-American cowboy in the foreground. So the bottom line is these works are not often explicit. Even if their subjects are African-American, as this one may be, there's much freedom of interpretation left to the eye of the beholder. And there's a Seltzer painting that illustrates this conundrum. The Bronco Buster features an obviously white cowboy struggling to stay astride a bucking horse in what should by now look like a pretty familiar pose to us. In the background, surrounded by some other, probably white cowboys, sits a dark figure on a white horse. It's impossible to know for sure if this represents an African-American cowboy or what Seltzer's intentions might have been. The text that originally accompanied this image stated only that the Bronco Buster's idea was to break the pony's heart so that it might buck again, but never so fiercely. There's been suggestion that African-American cowboys were usually called upon to do the hardest work about an outfit, which most often took form of topping or taking the first pitch out of rough horses. And this is another fascinating image with very little information associated with it in the collections. How common this actually was, like the number of African-American cowboys on the range, is anyone's guess. But the fact that it's a commonly believed trope, and that in Seltzer's work, this cowboy found his way into the background, should probably tell us something. Emil Lenders once insisted that painters like Charles Russell and Frederick Remington were U.S. history in a language all can understand, knowing full well that both had depicted scenes just as fantastic as those Hollywood would later conjure. Olaf Seltzer once commented somewhat bitterly of Charles Russell that, quote, "Sometimes a clear conscience merely indicates a poor memory." Cowboys captured the imagination of audiences because showmen, artists, and filmmakers crafted just the right mix of daring, romance, adventure, and ideals that conjured a certain nostalgia for the Wild West. Their success largely meant ignoring that which didn't sell, including the role of non-white cowboys, and any violence that did not fit within the parameters of defensive frontier justice. The notion of the chivalrous, hard-working cowboy who might sometimes necessarily skirt the edges of the law and who was as reliable with a six-gun as a rope rested on white privilege and the acceptance of the belief that cowboys inherently possessed the good character and benevolent intentions that myth ascribed to them. So cowboys effectively became a simulacrum, a heavily romanticized stand-in for the imperialist nostalgia of those who mourned the passing of the West, the very thing they'd helped intrinsically transform by drawing civilization across it. So white hats, metaphorically speaking, became a viable fashion statement once the real dirt and danger of the job was washed away. And I think this quote from Tom Mix is a great illustration, right? The Old West is whatever you want it to be, true then as now. So, thank you.
Oh, sure, now.
Lillian Smith, down one. That, yeah. Yeah, let's see how this works. Ooh. We'll see if that works. Good morning, everyone. Before I begin, I just want to say thank you to the staff of the Gilcrease and the Helmerich Center for inviting me to participate in this symposium and for assisting me with my research. You know, just to echo what Laura said earlier, there's a lot of folks who go into making something like this happen, and the support of the staff here has been really incredible. So today I'd like to talk a little bit about a woman named Lillian Smith and her career as a sharpshooter and entertainer in vaudeville and with Wild West shows. Lillian, who for many years went by her stage name Princess Winona, was a complicated woman who challenged a lot of expectations society had of women in the late 1800s and early 1900s. But at the same time she challenged gender norms, she reinforced a lot of racial expectations and stereotypes, particularly with regard to Native American people through her appropriation of Native identity as Princess Winona. Until recently, Lillian has been a lesser-known figure in the history of the American West and Wild West shows, but an important biography of her was written by historian Julia Bricklin and was published last year, and that's titled America's Best Female Sharpshooter, The Rise and Fall of Lillian Frances Smith. And I really encourage you to check it out because it's a very comprehensive look at her career and sort of one of the first major undertakings that sort of piece together what limited sources there are on Lillian's life and career. Until recently, Lillian didn't leave behind much writing, and primary sources about her are somewhat limited. There are, however, some wonderful objects in the Gilcrease Museum collection that belonged to Lillian during her life. So rather than sort of regurgitating the work Bricklin and other scholars have already done, I thought I'd turn my curatorial eye on the life and career of Lillian Smith. After all, I'm a museum curator. I love stuff. I love objects, material culture, all of that. That's my thing. I love revealing those stories that are contained within objects and sharing them with the public. So while I'll provide some background and context about Lillian, I'll also be sharing some thoughts on key objects related to her story and approaching them in the same way that I would if I were putting together an exhibit about Lillian's life. So, who was Lillian Smith? Lillian Frances Smith was born to Rebecca and Levi Smith in 1871 in Colville, California. The Smiths had moved west from New England sometime in the 1860s, eventually settling in California. They sort of moved around quite a bit, and then continued to move around within California, but that was basically their home base. Lillian did have one older brother, Charles, who was born back east and made the journey to California with their parents, and possibly one younger sister, Nellie, although there's no official indication that Rebecca had another child after Lillian. Nellie just sort of suddenly appears in the record, although there's no official record of her birth or appearance in many census records. When Lillian was a child, Levi, her father, began working as a commercial hunter of ducks and geese. Lillian and Charles often accompanied their father on his hunting expeditions, and these trips were in part how both children learned to shoot, and Lillian in particular. By all accounts, Lillian was an incredible shot, even as a child. And Levi recognized that talent, and more importantly, the financial benefits he could reap from it, and began promoting her as a trick shooter throughout California. So as an example of her shooting talent, I want to sort of share the story of her first formal appearance, which was at the Watsonville Opera House in June 1881. At this appearance, she shot and broke 12 glass balls, probably about yay big, sitting on 12 pegs in 12 shots. The newspaper, the Sacramento Record Union, wrote of her performance, and this is a direct quote, "Santa Cruz County has a shooting prodigy in the person of Lillian F. Smith, a 10-year-old girl who lives near Corralitos. She recently gave an exhibition of her skill at Watsonville and astonished the oldest sportsmen." So we know that in addition to the 12 glass balls on 12 pegs bit, Lillian also broke 10 glass balls on the same pegs in a minute, and then broke another 12 in 56 seconds, all while doing her own loading. Her finale was then to shoot at 14 glass balls that were lined up behind her, with her gun over her right shoulder, shooting with her left hand, with only a small hand mirror to sight her targets. She made the first 2 shots, missed the third and fourth, and then made the remaining 10, so effectively getting 12 out of 14 shots. And remember, she's only 10 years old when this happens. So this was only the beginning of her career. That's her first public appearance. Levi, continued to promote her shooting in expositions and demonstrations throughout California and then eventually around the country. She toured and performed almost constantly for the next 40 years, appearing in venues all over North America and even some appearances in Europe. So I'd like to take a moment here to talk a little bit about the kinds of guns Lillian worked with. So as a child and in the earliest years of her career, she primarily used a Ballard .22 caliber rifle. Her father gave her her first Winchester rifle, sort of, one of the iconic firearms associated with the West, around 1884, and she practiced with that until she was as proficient with the Winchester as she had been with the Ballard. Over the course of her 40-year career, she owned and used many different firearms, but she tended to prefer Winchester rifles. Most of these guns are unaccounted for today, but there were a few still in her possession when she died. And those are now in the Gilcrease Permanent Collection. And these include several rifles and 2 pistols. Oops. That's Lillian as a child, around the time that she joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which we'll get to in a little bit. But here are some images of the guns that are here in the Gilcrease collection. So we have the 2 1890 rifles, the 2 1892s, and then the Winchester model 1873. And this one, the 1873 is kind of interesting because it has this additional decoration. This is a close-up of a native man in profile in a plain-style war bonnet. There were also 2 pistols. Oops, this is going real fast. There we go. A gold-plated, pearl-handled Smith & Wesson .38 caliber, and then a gold-plated Smith & Wesson .22 caliber single shot, which is the gun on the bottom. And I'm not a firearms expert by any stretch, but I know enough to appreciate the physical demands of the work that Lillian did. She had to put up with the recoil from these rifles, and these are heavy guns. It's no small task to use a tool like this. There was lots of smoke from these performances, from the shots, all these rapid-fire shots that she was doing. And then also probably bits of glass, raining down on the stage around her as she succeeds in breaking her targets. Not to mention the incredible athleticism, coordination, and eyesight it would take to successfully perform these kinds of routines. So as a curator, I see these objects and they're just such a powerful representation of the immense skill and talent that Lillian had from such a young age. So Lillian's big break came in 1886 when she was invited to join Buffalo Bill's Wild West show as a sharpshooter. Levi, her father, was continuing to act as her manager, and she performed under the moniker the California Girl. And this was at the same time that Annie Oakley was also part of Buffalo Bill's show. And Annie Oakley is sort of the context in which Lillian has primarily been discussed up until recently, and sort of their rivalry, because there was this intense rivalry that formed when Lillian joined the show. And the ferocity of it sort of waxed and waned over the course of the two women's lives, but it did last until their deaths. In some ways, the two women had a lot in common, and in others, they couldn't be more different, but they were both women navigating a professional world that had really been dominated by men up until their appearance. So one of the staples of the Wild West show was the Cowboy, and I love that I'm coming right after Laura's talk, where she has so wonderfully sort of set up that expectation. The Cowboy, who offered audiences this image of sort of unwavering and uncomplicated masculinity. As historian Richard White points out, American space and American experience during the golden age of the Cowboy were often expressed in terms of masculine and feminine. The frontier was masculine. Machines and cities were its antithesis. They emasculated men, robbed them of their true manhood. Thus, cities and machines were defined as feminine. As a result of this sort of gendering of America, the representatives of the wilderness, cowboys, men, and the representatives of civilization, in this case white women, and particularly educated or cultured white women, were presented in a polarized way. So as historian Will Wright notes, that myth shows, of course, what the myth shows, of course, is that men should be dominant, aggressive, confident, and strong, while women should be dependent, subservient, weak, and passive. In particular, men should be competitive and self-interested, while women should be compassionate and moral. So the extreme nature of these qualities then that are associated with femininity caused any woman who didn't conform to them to stand out even more. So women like Annie Oakley, like Lillian Smith, who challenged the conventions of femininity, risked drawing unwanted attention and being ostracized by the general public. So this contrast between masculinity and femininity that was so central to the mythological West was really condensed in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show in the figures of Lillian Smith and Annie Oakley. They personified the conflict between the masculine and feminine in the Wild West. Their jobs with the Wild West show were as sharpshooters and marksmen, jobs typically identified with men at the time. And as Richard White again observes, this kind of behavior created what he calls a kind of cultural cross-dressing. On the one hand, they were expected to behave like their male colleagues, like cowboys, shooting and riding like men, but on the other, Lillian and Annie were still seen as women with, and this is a direct quote about Annie Oakley, the shy sweetness of a little country girl. Physically, their appearances and costumes then take on the aspects of the two sides they represented. They both wore the sort of feminine skirt or dress and in appropriate styles for the time, but then in materials and with decoration designed to appear more rustic and therefore Western, and also, a little more masculine. So buckskin, rope trim, fringe, all of these sort of physical elements then appear in their costuming. And you can see some of that in the photograph here of Lillian, the sort of rusticating of her appearance. They also both wore variations on the more masculine cowboy hat and neckerchief. So during her tenure with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, Lillian earned widespread acclaim and traveled to England, where she performed for and met Queen Victoria. She also met her first serious romantic partner, Jim the Kid Willoughby, who was around 14 years older than her, and she was only 14, 15 years old at the time. The two married suddenly in 1886 without the permission of her family. While there was certainly some genuine affection between the two, I think it's important to point out that Lillian almost certainly had another motive for pairing up with Willoughby. By marrying him, she finally got out from under the yoke of her father, Levi. As Julia Bricklin, who did the biography on Lillian, notes, Lillian and Jim's marriage incensed Levi, especially since it happened right under his nose. Worst of all, another man was now legally and morally in charge of her future. If she managed to stay in show business, all earnings would ostensibly be managed by Willoughby. So Lillian's marriage to Willoughby then it did gain her some measure of independence, but unfortunately it didn't last very long. She continued to perform with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show until late 1888, when for sort of uncertain reasons, although it's likely that it had something to do with her rivalry with Annie Oakley, she wasn't invited to continue with the show on its return to Europe. Willoughby, however, was. So Lillian then returned to California and her family while Willoughby, continued traveling with the Buffalo Bill show. And at some point in 1889, she officially ended her relationship with Willoughby, and they were divorced. She spent roughly the next 10 years performing, once again under the management of her father, and helping to run various shooting galleries that the Smith family opened throughout the American West. So at some point around 1898, 1899, Lillian met a man named Frank Heffley. Frank was also an accomplished marksman and was formerly a sheriff, actually. And they formed not only a romantic partnership, but also a performing one. And you'll have to forgive me for the quality of this photo. It's not a great shot, but it shows Lillian and Frank in a publicity. Still, this is actually from later in their career, by the time she's going by Winona. But it shows an element of their act together. So although it's unclear whether they ever legally married, Lillian and Frank moved to Chicago in 1900 in order to pursue more performance opportunities. And recognizing Lillian's already considerable reputation at this point, the couple used her name in their performances, her last name, going by Lillian and Frank Smith as opposed to Heffley, which is sort of unique because Annie Oakley retained her stage persona even after she married Frank Butler, but Frank Butler still went by Frank Butler. He didn't go by Frank Oakley. So it's sort of an interesting relationship that Lillian and Frank had. So Lillian continued to perform many of the same kinds of tricks she had been performing throughout her career, now with Frank as her assistant. So for example, one part of their act, and this is what this image refers to, consisted of Frank wearing a hat with these small glass balls attached around the brim, which Lillian would shoot at and break. So talk about trust. She would also shoot the ash off the end of a cigar held in Frank's mouth, or the center of an ace playing card held in his hand. Like this one from the Gilcrease collection. So this says, shot by Lillian F. Smith, the California girl, champion rifle shot of the world while held in the hand of Frank Smith. And you can see the bullet hole right here, right through the center of the club. And they would use cards like this as sort of a promotional material to promote their act and get additional bookings. So Lillian received her next big break in 1901 when she and Frank were invited to join Frederick Cummins' Indian Congress, who were scheduled to appear during the upcoming World's Fair in Buffalo, New York. Cummins' Indian Congress promised to be a grand, elaborate spectacle of Western life, trading in the mythologized image of the Wild West, cowboys, Indians, daring escapades, all of that iconography that we associate with Wild West shows. So prior to her debut at the World's Fair, Lillian made the professional decision that would inform the rest of her career. She transformed herself from Lillian Smith, the California girl, into Princess Winona, the lost Sioux princess. Lillian, Frank, and Frederick Cummins probably all saw this new identity as a better fit with the overall feel of the show and as a way for Lillian to set herself apart from other women sharpshooters by trading in the image of the Western lady for the exoticized image of indigenous womanhood. After all, by this time, the idea of women shooting wasn't nearly as foreign as it had been at the start of Lillian's career, in no small part due to the work she and Annie Oakley had done to normalize shooting as a family-friendly pastime. Lillian, now Winona, left behind the elaborate Victorian dresses and began performing in buckskin dresses, long braids, and she would even darken her skin by painting it with grease paint. And so this image, this is a program from the World's Fair, with the great bison head, and then this is a detail image from the interior showing Winona on horseback. And this whole page that it's from describes various Native American exhibits and activities that attendees to the fair could partake in. So the museum has one of her dresses in their collection, and a close look at it reveals it to be of simple construction with a sort of mishmash of decoration intended to mimic the style of dresses worn by women from native nations of the Northern Plains. There are large beads, fringe, ermine tails, and even a little fabric floret and a small beaded brooch used to close at the neckline. So I have some detail shots. So here you see some of the beads on the fringe. Here's that floret, the beaded brooch, and then a shot of the ermine tails, and you can see sort of the whole overall mishmash effect. Unsurprisingly, the overall effect is that of a cheesy knockoff of the real thing. But the largely white audiences Winona performed for almost certainly didn't know the difference. Julia Bricklin points out another added benefit of Lillian's new wardrobe. She had a much greater range of movement in the buckskin dresses than she had in corsets and full skirts. So this allowed her to pursue more complicated tricks, including the addition of trick shooting from horseback. So we have some images here. This is a sort of a souvenir button that shows Winona on horseback at probably a trot here with Frank in front, and this is how they would perform the equestrian tricks in the show. He would ride in front and throw up the targets, and she would shoot them from behind. And it's really incredible athleticism to do that. And this is a later image of Lillian once she's part of the Miller Brothers 101 Ranch show. By all accounts, Lillian, now Winona, was a massive success at the World's Fair. The public loved her new routine, and from then on, Lillian performed as Princess Winona. She began doing beadwork, which she would then sell as a side gig during her tours. Lillian and Frank invented an entire past for Winona, a story that would change over the ensuing years, becoming more and more elaborate. It relied heavily on romanticized and racist stereotypes of Native American cultures. For example, in one version, her mother was a white woman abducted by the Lakota, and Winona was the daughter of the chief. In this version of her biography, her father had her adopted by a white family after his death. She then attended the Carlisle Indian School, graduated with honors, but then, and then this is a quote from one of the promotional biographies circulated about her, once more donned the blanket of the Sioux and became active in the tribe's welfare. And I find this last part particularly problematic and cringeworthy because not only had Lillian appropriated the identity of an indigenous woman at this point, this white woman masquerading as a Native person positioned herself then as the savior of her people, serving as just another example of a white savior complex. And that's something that continues to play out in film and media about the West even to this day. She constructed a fictional character from the very real experiences of actual Native peoples, oftentimes traumatic experiences like those endured by the children at the Carlisle Indian School in order to turn a profit. And as a white woman, she could put on and take off this persona whenever it suited her, enjoying all of the white public's fascination with Native cultures and suffering none of the systemic racism. After the end of the World's Fair and the disbanding of Cummins' Indian Congress, Lillian and Frank returned to the vaudeville circuit. For several years, they moved between sort of one-off performances and extended bookings with other Wild West shows, including Winona's initial experience with the Miller Brothers 101 Ranch Wild West show in 1907. They even had a foray of their own into Wild West show management in the form of California Frank's Wild West in 1908. However, change was on the horizon for Lillian and for Frank. The romantic side of their relationship ended in 1908 when he fell in love with and married another performer by the name of Mamie Francis. However, it appears that the split was amicable, and Frank and Lillian's professional relationship continued for a few years more. Lillian and Mamie even became friends and performed together after Frank stopped actually appearing in the shows. So Frank and Lillian's professional partnership finally came to an end in late 1910, early 1911, when she decided to rejoin the Miller Brothers 101 Ranch Wild West show. She performed with them as Princess Winona until 1922, when she made her final public appearance. Her years with the Miller Brothers show were probably some of the most stable and consistent in her life. She had, or at least was reported to have had, a few relationships with men after Frank Heffley, although some of them may have been fabricated as publicity stunts. And this image here is of her and a cowboy performer with the Miller Brothers show, Wayne Beasley, who she probably did actually have a relationship with. When she decided to leave Frank's show and head over to the Miller Brothers, part of the contract was that Wayne be able to come with her. And he was a trick roper. She did, for a time at least, fetch up with the painter Emma Lenders, who Laura was mentioning earlier. And really throughout the remainder of her life, she continued to flout traditional expectations about heterosexual relationships and, settling down. And instead found community with the other performers and employees of the 101. Eventually, she could no longer keep up with the demands of public performance and retired. She continued to live on and around the 101 ranch, performing odd jobs here and there, like helping to break horses or writing reminiscences of her life for local publications. And it's interesting to note that these reminiscences may have been an indicator that Lillian was ready to kind of set aside her Winona identity later in life. Sadly, like so many other performers during her era, Lillian didn't have the financial cushion once she stopped performing, and the last years of her life were spent in very meager conditions. She did have some close friends who continued to check on her and help care for her, especially once her health began to decline. She died of heart failure in January 1930. One of her final wishes was to be buried under her birth name, Lillian Smith, so sort of officially at the end of her life setting aside the Winona identity. So in addition to the other guns that I mentioned earlier, Lillian also had in her possession when she died another Winchester Model 1890 rifle. And this one is housed in a special case decorated with her name and containing several bits of ephemera related to her career. So there's a photo of Joe Miller. There's a promotional flyer from the 101 Ranch Wild West show that's here, and then this is a close-up of that, which includes some handwritten notes by Lillian on it, which I think is kind of interesting. And I love this one. It says, "Note to me, northwest end of the show, exit dummy," and then W. So it's just a little note to herself about where to go at the end of a performance. There's also a photo of her as Winona with a dog named Blue, which is right here. And then a 1926 101 Ranch official touring route calendar. And I think it's particularly interesting that this is pointer's failing, 1926 calendar, because that's after she had made her last public appearance. So I find this assemblage of materials particularly interesting and sort of bittersweet, because it suggests this nostalgia on Lillian's part for her time with the 101 Ranch Wild West show and for her time as an entertainer, and this sort of, clutching of that memory and that experience at the end of her life when, fame and all of that was behind her. So what do we make of someone like Lillian Smith? So, over the course of her career, she challenged so many expectations about women. She broke new ground for women in the entertainment industry, especially in Wild West shows. She was incredibly talented, but she did so in large part by appropriating Native American cultures and histories. She benefited from her whiteness especially when she was pretending to be Lakota. And so she has a place in the United States legacy of racism towards indigenous peoples and the destructive practice of cultural appropriation of Native cultures by white people. Lillian's life was full of contradictions, and she was living during a time of enormous and rapid change in the United States and the world. And I think there's this impulse to often try and view the past as simpler, but that's really just nostalgia in play. The lives of people like Lillian Smith show us that human experiences have always been complicated, and understanding that might help us better understand and engage with the complexities facing us today. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Natalie, for organizing this event and inviting me. This is wonderful. Thank you, Renee, for being such a wonderful help in the research and working in the archives. She's simply fantastic if you get a chance to work with her. I can't say strongly enough how wonderful she is. So my research here really started with that bow, that really large bow. And I do a lot of work on rodeo cowgirls, and one of the comments often is about their dress and their attire. And so I wanted to look more deeply at what inspires them to dress the way that they do, what's happening, what are the conditions that allow them to enter their first professional sport for women in the United States, ride bronking in the bronc riding events and rough stock events. And so I wanted to look a bit at that and how that shaped these women. So I kind of backtracked just a bit to their work on the ranch. But a lot of my work here looks at three main things that shape their lives. And one has to do with the national or that kind of general idea about gender standards as far as what's driving how women should act and what they should wear and what the limitations are. A lot of that originates in the East and it just moves west. And so that's one factor. The other factor for women in the West is the concern of how they're going to be corrupted by exposure to indigenous persons who are already living in the West and, my goodness, riding astride, that kind of thing. And then the third thing really is cowboy sexuality. This is the third thing that really kind of drives what these women are making as far as the choices that they're making. So I want to talk a bit about that background, and then we'll look at some buttons and bows. So growing up in a small town of 300 people, about 35 miles from the nearest grocery store, my hometown stayed a good 20 years behind the world fashion, and probably in many other ways too, the standards. We did manage to follow some trends through popular magazines, and attempting to be modern women, we would follow them to change our hair, maybe our blouses, our suit jacket, but we never gave up our Wranglers and our boots, because that's how we lived. Much like women of the developing American West, we formed our own identities reflective of our rural lifestyle and our own interpretation of femininity. Pioneering women settling the American West have long been viewed as living life against the grain, and in many ways they have. But women did not simply appear in the rodeo arena wearing their favorite jeans, ready to ride a bronc or rope a steer. A sociological phenomenon in ranching culture at the end of the 19th and early 20th century provided timely conditions for women to work on ranches that advanced them into professional careers in rodeo. Although men that they worked with respected women for their capable skills and their work ethic, and then later in their competition in rodeo, the broader national perspective about appropriate gender roles was not so progressive. Women raised working on ranches then lived in a blend of the old and the new, where a bit of Eastern tradition combined with Western reality and shaped how they viewed themselves and their place as a woman. A crisis of masculinity that forms in the East as post-industrialism affects them socially between 1870 and 1900, hardens that division between the genders. And it stipulates for women that they have to wear limiting clothing, they're prohibited from participation in public events and athletic activities. In the West, this patriarchal culture combined with concerns that women would appropriate those uncivilized manners from Native Americans, and then additionally those legendary stories of undisciplined cowboys motivated mothers to really instill ladylike conduct for their daughters to balance the manly work with their feminine qualities necessary for them to later become a wife and mother. Cowgirls dressing in men's clothes to do this work had, by the 1880s, particularly after 2 or more generations on the ranch, balanced that non-gendered work life in the seclusion of the ranches to what sometimes seemed like their alter ego in public. The result of living in such conditions leads to a counter-hegemonic masculinity, because the broader standard of masculinity and patriarchal laws outside the West limited opportunities for women to become self-made, as was expected of men at that time. And in light of concerns that women working in male jobs would become mannish, it seemed that there would be no compromise between the extremely masculine images of women who did openly contest these restrictions, like Calamity Jane, and the urban woman who was a proper Victorian lady. Yet, in the case of ranching women, they used these liberties afforded to them in the rural West to simply create a new image, and that was the image of the cowgirl. The reality of early territorial settlement was that survival took place over concerns about gender roles. The binary system in the urban East, where gender roles were established on principle, were also defined by space, largely referred to as spheres. The sphere of domesticity was a woman's space or her private domain, while the public sphere was the man's domain, where he could move freely, participate in public debate, as well as recreation or sports. These were not adequate in that vast rural West. The frontier that placed girls into an environment that offered unconventional freedoms originated with their responsibilities outside of the domestic realm. So while some chores, like gathering eggs, feeding, watering the livestock, fell within norms that were similar to those of rural farms in the East, the openness of the West extended the opportunity for girls to get out of the barnyard. Watching over grazing livestock or herding cattle frequently took a girl out to pasture for much of the day, often unsupervised and on horseback. So unlike urban areas where girls were required to ride side saddles, sometimes under the authority of city law or ordinances, these girls working on the range would ride astride. They learned to ride, rope, brand, veterinary skills, all necessary to contribute to the ranch's success. And many of these girls were riding before they could walk. Lacking inhibitions, these young girls proved that this was an important part of the necessary process and development of this new feminine standard. The freedom that adolescent girls experienced wearing their hair loose and their skirts calf length was not lost on progressive women as well. And I have an example from Frances Willard, who wrote in her autobiography. No girl went through harder experience than I when my free out-of-door life had to cease, and the long skirts, clubbed up hair, spiked with hairpins, had to be endured. I always believed that if I had been let alone and allowed to live as a woman what I had had as a girl, a free life in the country, where a human being might grow, body and soul, as a tree grows, I would have been 10 times more the person every way. The state of mind that I revealed in my journal about that time was that this is my birthday and the date of my martyrdom. Mother insists that at last I must have my hair done up in a woman fashion, and here I sit like Samson, shorn of my strength. A change in expectations as girls matured, which was limiting in the East, was added responsibility for these girls in the West. So girls ages 5 to 9 was working smaller herds or closer to the house. By the time they were teenagers, were expected to extend their responsibilities, which often took them into the hills to bring in the cattle from the winter or into distant pastures. And so in this way, chores in open spaces transformed these girls, teaching them confidence, ingenuity, and as many reported later in their life, an appreciation for solitude. And many of these girls learned to cowboy just as well, if not sometimes better, than the boys. So back to the crisis of 1870, this crisis in masculinity that propels men westward had basically been fueled by these mythical stories that my colleagues have both spoken about, the embellishment about the opportunity in the West became an answer to answer the crisis in masculinity. It was a place where men could actively participate in civilizing the region. The premise of a threat to masculinity is important in the development of these rigid gender norms, but also in sustaining it, because the escalated crisis extends this concern nationally. And so even though attempting to escape the conditions caused by industrialization and civilization, the efforts to reclaim that masculinity in the West by the turn of the century recreate it to an extent, to some degree, in what we call the Victorian West. Indeed, opening the frontier provided opportunity for many to reinvent themselves. Men who had grown soft in the urban East could reclaim their masculine identity and be more directly involved in reestablishing patriarchy and power on the rugged frontier. Untamed, wild, and a dangerous place, it offered for men the opportunity to prove their courage, manliness, and their skill in the Anglo-described virgin territory. Popular dime novels that created hyper-masculine cowboys whose physical attributes and strength made unestablished territories an appealing area of immense possibility. However, again, survival in this unsophisticated environment inadvertently produced pliable gender roles. Ranching redefined and simplified masculinity, now measured through survivability, work ethic, and toughness. But it was an environment where men embraced and respected women's contributions. The result of living in this quasi-progressive masculinity contributed to what I call hegemonic femininity, so a new feminine standard forms in this regional setting. The Eastern patriarchal policies like city ordinances against women riding astride that transferred into some cities in the West were not functional for women working on the ranch who had to ride a California saddle with a saddle horn in order to rope a stray and to do their job. Furthermore, women worked in men's clothing in order to avoid injury, where draped materials might be caught up in a stirrup when they're trying to tame a young horse. By the time the middle-class women's movement began to challenge patriarchal obstructions toward women, they turned to Western territories where many of their goals had already come to fruition. The effort to solicit the support of Western women found few results in rural communities. Feminists hoping to align with women found cowgirls responded by avoiding feminist movements, distancing themselves from ideas like bloomerism, free love, and utopian socialism. Cowgirls were not trying to make a scene or cause a scandal like those caused by the bloomer girls. Outspoken feminists who encouraged women to take control of their lives by wearing pants as a way to liberate women from social restrictions recognized criticisms that spoke to wives who persisted in maintaining some of their rights as also wanting to rule their husband, or as the phrase went, wear the breeches. Yet the implied idea that pants are allied to power is correct. Long and entangling skirts are a type of general lack of power. Cowgirls were further removed from this issue because challenge to the patriarchal power was foreign to them, as they had received support from the men that they worked alongside on the ranch, many of whom shared in the domestic chores. Labor on the ranch went both ways. Men helped in the kitchen, men helped mending, and women worked outside. So it was real equality to some degree. Another concern for women in the late 19th century and early 20th was that their participation in activity outside their sphere would result in them becoming mannish, which previews what today would be described as homophobia. 19th century concerns about transgenderism and homosexuality are rarely discussed in the pro-masculine West and are often described as people with, the way Peter Bogue describes them in his Redressing the West, unnatural tendencies. He says, if a man had sexual desires for another man, a feminine trait, he also, it was supposed, wished to dress in women's clothing and had other feminine characteristics. The few women openly working in male occupations like U.S. Army Scout Calamity Jane, E.J. Gergen, and Joe Monahan appear to have done so to provide for themselves or their children, although it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only reason they did it. It just appears that way from the sources that we have. Finally, mothers who insisted that their daughters have a civil and proper manner to set them apart from those uncivilized, and as well as the rascal cowboys that they may encounter off the family ranch, strongly influenced their decision to enforce this behavior. The working cowboy began as a low-wage laborer, a ruffian, long before the created iconic image of the white hat, the upstanding representation of American manhood. The sexualization of the cowboy starts with the romanticization of that rugged cowman in the 19th century dime novels that focused on the cowboy of the cattle drives and morphed into the sex symbol of the Marlboro man. But as early as 1867, writers describing cowboys in newspapers as they described as being full of reserve, force in the prime of manhood, usually tall, muscular, well-built, slim, sinewy, and with sunburned faces. The lonesome cowboy who revered womanhood as a rarity on the range evolved into what's known as the cowboy code. The cowboy's role was to take any insult against a woman personally and thus react violently to the male transgressor. The re-imaging of the tough guy hero is primarily owed to Buffalo Bill, who recreates him in Wild West shows, changing that tough and disorderly character from the rowdy cowpoke blowing off steam in the saloon at the end of the drive as a protagonist. When cowgirls left their ranches and entered the public arena in Wild West shows, and then later in rodeo, her public image forced juxtaposition to this cowboy. Femininity always demands more. It must constantly reassure its audience by a willing demonstration of difference, even when it does not exist in nature. And femininity, therefore, makes men appear more masculine. In the case of women working in these extremely masculine roles, cowgirls decided to over-accentuate their femininity, not to please the men. The cowboys they worked with accepted them for their skill and respected their abilities, but to reassure urban audiences, and then more importantly, to stay true to herself. The cowgirl's personal choice to beautify her costume removed public concern about them becoming mannish, but more importantly, it shifts the focus to her work and to her athletic skills. This is an important distinction by the end of the 19th century because more women are entering the workforce nationally, making up 18.9% of the labor force. And in urban areas, women received technical training manuals that urged dressing for success and advised a middle ground in clothing, one neither too feminine, avoiding fluffy, frilly collars, and not too masculine, so they were to avoid tweeds. These were written into the manuals for them. Cowgirls competing and performing for those audiences of women were proving to all sexes that they were athletic, that they were not manly, and that they developed their own functional definition of what was feminine. So if you look at an example like Calamity Jane, this picture really shows her in her work costume, right? She has her tools, her gun belt, her rifle with her, and she has that heavier leather that she's wearing. And this is with the show. And so here she's kind of starting to move a little bit more toward some embroidered embellishment, although she is missing that very large silk scarf that will become popular a bit later with the cowgirls. It's not too feminine, it's still job specific, but it's a bit more feminine than the previous photo because she does have a little bit of embellishment on her shirt. Here, I just wanted to also show, this is obviously she's riding a bronc, but you can see that she's in a skirt. This is a little bit shorter skirt here, and you can kind of see her stockings underneath. Her boots are showing, and I'm going to talk more about those in just a second. Again, large, extra large bows. Bloomers to kind of stay out of the rigging, and they often taped these up if they didn't have elastic available to try to keep these skirts close into their stocking. Her boots are embellished just a bit, and most of those were handmade at the time. Another here, a picture to kind of juxtapose the femininity. The girls have, one has hearts on her boots, that's Ruth, and then she also has what looks like silk or satin type material. It's much more lightweight. And obviously for the relay race, her boots are a little bit different. They kind of look like wrestling boots. And their hats, you can see, are a little bit bigger than his, just to kind of give some contrast. All right, so this picture, this is a staged photo titled From the Flower of the Prairie, but it really kind of captures the working cowgirl with her tools necessary to do her job. So she has her rope, she has her gun belt, and she has the thicker roughed out leather gloves. Her hat, which of course was necessary, it's a bit less showy than what we see in the rodeo arena a bit later. But it still has some personalization with the hat pins embellished, and then she has a blouse that's kind of a soft velvet. So fabric's important in feminizing what they're wearing also. So ranching cowgirls' decision to go public with their masculine work skills is really not a bold transgendered statement or one that is of great proclamation about the liberation of dress on rural ranches. But it's evident of their physical ability, their personal style, their individual interpretation about their own femininity. And it contrasts the cowgirls to the men who were their co-workers and co-competitors. In Wild West show, vaudeville, and rodeo, payment to some extent was contingent on ticket sales. And so for this reason, they had to be cognizant of audience reaction. But even if cowgirls had entered the arena in less than feminine attire very early on, their skills really would have only carried them so far. And I think we kind of see this in the case of Lillian Smith, who is often criticized for not being as petite or as ladylike as Annie Oakley. And so they're really looking for something that kind of works to help sustain their career, but then staying true to themselves as well, using these extra large bows, often as big as the hat, which later some of the girls bobbed their hair just a little bit later, and the bows kind of hide that just a bit. This picture of Ruth, and she's a champion bronc rider and trick rider. She's got her large brim hat. Often the girls' hats were 8-inch brims with an equally large silk bow. Also feminizing her costume here, she has that lengthy fringe on the collar, the sleeves, and the pockets. And her split skirt is accentuated with small concho-type brads. This minimizes the seams and kind of make her appear a bit more dainty. Now, important in this photo, too, her tack. The horse's bridle is embellished with silver daisy-shaped conchos to give it kind of a showy but still feminine appearance here. So again, their wardrobe selection is really about style and purpose. The large silk bow, the satiny or silk blouses, and the scarf that she's wearing here is, it's a statement scarf, but this is also a functional scarf. There are occasions that the girls wrote about where the scarf basically kept their blouse tied on because of a wardrobe malfunction while they're riding a killer bronc. And so in this photo, you can kind of see how fashion is advanced through the period. They're moving away from the longer split skirts that often contributed to injury. And when a skirt caught in bronc rigging, cowgirls began to try to wear this bloomer-style skirt shown here. The legs of the skirt, as I said earlier, are kind of gathered with elastic or tied to keep them tucked in near the knee and reducing the risk of injury. Again, it's not necessarily a feminist statement from their perspective. This is really a logical career choice because it relates to fewer injuries, which prolongs their career. The fabrics, the silk, the soft velvet, again, trimmed with scarves and sashes, are sometimes evident, like in probably the most well-known for her fashion statements is Prairie Rose Henderson. She's the second from the right. She has a fur-trimmed hem on an embroidered overlay over her costume. And then there are also the custom boots. As I said earlier, Ruth Roach's boots have hearts on them. Prairie Rose's has a filigree trim, and that often reflects their personalities. Girls who worked at the 101 helped with the ranch work as well as completing their contract work for the show. And in this photo, you can see some of the elements here that really indicate her priority of the job. The tack is more simple on the horse. It does not have the embellishment she would use in the show ring. Although she does have some fringe on the skirt. She has the softer fabric for the blouse and her scarf. And the bow, which feminizes her work clothes. But her gloves here, again, are the little bit more sturdy gloves for roping. I like this photo because it kind of shows the subtle differences between the cowboy and the cowgirl attire. All are wearing shirts and split-legged bottoms, but the men's material is not that soft, shiny silk. And the girls jodhpurs or bloomers have. They all have their boot tops showing. The men have their pants tucked in, but the cowgirls either gather or tapered the hem just below the knee that reveal the stockings. The men have belts. The women have the more feminine sash. And the shininess of the boots and the clean chaps here indicate this is a staged photo, but the side-by-side I thought really gives a good look at that equality that these girls were experiencing. So in her biography, Women in Levi's, Eulalia Bourne says, "Whatever I am, the West produced me, and I was not trying to make a spectacle of myself. I had nothing but business on my mind, with trade as my purpose. I was not dressed to pass inspection by style-conscious bystanders. Although she wore her Levi's just a bit later than these rodeo cowgirls, it was the same West that provided the sociological phenomenon for these women to transcend gender divisions of labor and create this new hegemonic femininity where a woman could do man's work and remain feminine in the image of the cowgirl that she created." Thank you.
Okay.
I'm wondering, and as we're discussing cowboys, cowgirls, and the ways that those roles were associated with gender, I'm wondering if any of you have any insights on why people who worked with herding cattle were not referred to as cowmen.
There's several answers.
Do you want to take that one more?
Yeah.
I'll take a second and then y'all jump in, because there's so many ways to go with this. There's There's a few answers. Granville Stewart, when he's talking about the men who work for him, actually says they prefer to be called cow punchers. And it's kind of buried in the language. But if we go back to Cowboys is emerging out of this kind of Reconstruction era, and so many of their number being African American, the thought and the idea, and I think there needs to be much more research on this. I'm not a lexicographer or whatever, the fancy name for people who study language, but the idea being that boy is a derogatory, like, racial reference of referring to black men as boys. So there's one part of that answer. Ladies.
And the word itself actually is rooted in Ireland. The first usage of it had to do with boys who were herding cattle in Ireland and came over. And then in Florida, it continues similar to what's in South Carolina with African Americans who are slaves, who are working in that job. But in Florida, it morphs into crackers. So when whites start ranching in Florida, and part of that's reference to them using whips, cattle whips, and they're called crackers. And so more of it into the West, from what my understanding is, has to do with class. It's a working wage job. So thank you for the question.
Yeah, that's a great question.
There's one.
It has to do with the class that you may were the owner, so we call it commons. And maybe that is the difference.
Hey, Johanna, thank you so much. I'm wondering if I don't know if you mentioned this or not, do you know how Lillian Smith first met Cody, or how he became aware of her, and did they reconnect when they appeared together kind of in the last year of his life with the 101 Ranch? Did you run across that?
You know, I didn't come across much about the relationship that they had, such as it was. I mean, the historical record is pretty vague on how she sort of got to each sort of stage of her career. They certainly would have reconnected to some degree when he joined the Miller Brothers show, but from the sources that we have, she was pretty much sort of doing her own thing by that point, and probably didn't spend that much time reconnecting with him. And when she was with the Buffalo Bill show, so much of that rivalry with Annie Oakley was kind of spurred on and fueled by Cody, that I find it kind of hard to believe that there was much camaraderie there. I think he was her employer.
In what way? Right.
That sort of idealized femininity in the East specifically, because that's where he was working, versus the sort of iconic image of the cowgirl that was beginning to evolve at this time, especially with the silent film and Wild West shows. How do you think those two were perceived differently?
Well, partially, the Gibson Girl, as that idea kind of moves into the era of the new woman, and changes just a bit, they separate. So again, cowgirls are really defining femininity for themselves. Gibson girls did not always. They're kind of following that, because most of them are still within that modest standard. Does that make sense? And so that's also where some of those training manuals that were written come in, for typists, especially as they start working. They want them to have the very plain shirtwaist, And so that's supposed to fit in with that Gibson girl image. But for cowgirls, it's more functionality with a little touch of femininity. I hope that answers your question. Hi.
By chance, do you know how in the heck they kept that bow in their hair?
I had that question at the break. I really do not know how they fastened the bow in. It's not attached to their hat because often, especially there are some pictures that we have of them where they remove their hat after a ride and it's attached to their hair. But it's a great question. I'd love to know the answer. It's going to take a bit more research.
Well, antique like hairpins from that time are like this long because women tended to have the long hair that was coiled up, so maybe.
Just a really short follow-up question on that. You said how they kept the bows in. Are there any of the bows in any of the collections to look at that they survived?
Renee, do you have? I haven't seen any. Yeah, I have not seen them in any of my travels either. And for my book, it focuses on rodeo cowgirls, and so I just have not seen those in the collections. The Washington Historical Society has some more recent cowgirl attire, but not any extending back this far.
And if you don't mind me jumping in on that a little bit, from sort of a material culture perspective, it's not that surprising to me that we're not seeing a lot of those still in existence. You know, when you think about, you know, as Tracy was discussing the fabrics used and the wear and tear of them, that they likely just disintegrated and were thrown out over time.
Thanks for the question.